This is Duncan So. He's the founder of the Burnout Recovery Accelerator.
To make the definition really simple so we can actually begin interventions in a very easy way is when you spend more energy than you can recover as a habit, that's burnout territory, right? Give sort of like what it is, and it's not stress. So today now is really overused. It's like a buzzword. So especially for the younger generation, if they sneeze, they're like, oh, this is burnout, right? They declared that definition under the international classifications of diseases. So we know it's like a disease. But what they're also very clear about in the ICD is it's not a medical condition. It's a management or mismanagement, so it presupposes you can manage it, of chronic stress.
What about the candidates who are kind of like early on and they're like, oh, I'm listening to this podcast and I see a couple of characteristics there which are maybe, bubbling up. What are some ideas that you might have for those individuals?
Yeah, so, just to give a little bit of a framework for everybody, I'll give 4 levers.
What are the signs of somebody that is using stress as fuel? How do you know it's going too far into a burnout territory?
Actually, so broadly speaking, I call this the 5 paths.
Yeah, I was going to ask you.
I have all 5 of those.
Yeah. Randal, we won't make this personal. Jetset!
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Jetset Physical Therapy Podcast. I'm here, as always, with my co-host, Jay Bott. And we have a guest today, Duncan So. He is the founder of the Burnout Recovery Accelerator. So for all of you folks that are suffering from burnout, this is something new to me that I'm starting to see that there's people actually offering solutions, and Duncan is somebody that specializes in that. So I'm very happy to have you on. Thank you for joining us today, Duncan.
You're welcome. Super excited to be here.
Yeah. All right. So I think the proper first thing to do first would be to define what burnout is. So
yeah, I love this one. This is the foundation question. So usually what I like to start, especially with burnout, is what it isn't, right? I mean, that's sort of the easy case, right? So a lot of us today, back in 2018 is sort of when burnout became a little bit more of a popular thing, because the Gallup poll does a lot of sort of big level analysis around workplace engagement. And so they've been doing that for 15, 20 years. And if anybody's ever heard of or taken some sort of engagement survey, it was probably through their work, going through that, bringing that into the world. And, burnout was coined in, the mid 70s, the late 70s. And I'll speak to a lot of the physiotherapists here just because it was initially for doctors and frontline workers. We'll go into a little bit of moral injury later today. But it became really a phenomenon, a quote unquote workplace phenomena, when technology and the internet generation start to really pick up. And so I'll give sort of like what it is, and it's not stress, right? So stress is something like, even on the physical side, being physical therapists, physical stress can be very useful for growth. When I go to the gym, really great to help me be more flexible, increase my weight, do all that stuff. You can imagine the same thing on the mental emotional side. When we need to stretch ourselves, like maybe there's a goal that we set out there that's beyond sort of what we're used to, and it helps us to sort of design our lives beyond our thinking when we grow. That is positive stress on the mental emotional side. So it's not that, right? So I can imagine from a physiotherapist perspective, or I'll call it nurses, teachers, those that deal with volume and are right on the front lines of caregiving. A lot of that is on the emotional side, right? Yes, there's physical labor and work involved, but it's like, how do we stretch ourselves emotionally, sometimes even spiritually, to help, support the health and well-being of others, right? You can call it that way. And so any projects, initiatives, things like that create that type of stress is the same thing like going to the gym. It's actually a good thing. It's one of those things where if you can actually, quote unquote, sleep it off, not burnout, right? And so fast forward today, it's 2026, so we're post-pandemic. So we had a very interesting period in our entire like recorded history, right? It's not like it's one of those things where we go through like plagues and pandemics every day. And so, from what the heck is burnout, nobody really understood about this to today now is really overused. It's like a buzzword. So especially for the younger generation, if they sneeze, they're like, oh, this is burnout, right? And so when they come into my work, my clinical practice, I have to unpack that. Like, okay, let's unpack that. What does burnout specifically mean to you? And of course, today we'll go into some of the more specific physiotherapy narratives around that, or therapist narratives around that. And so we'll throw in sort of what the World Health Organization initially sort of framed burnout as first. And then I'll sort of debunk a few things just because, the world's changed. I'm on the front lines and working with people as the world's evolving. That definition hasn't really been updated recently. And so sort of loosely put the words for the World Health Organization is they called it sort of mismanaged chronic stress in the workplace. Specifically in the workplace leads to things like fatigue, leads to things like depersonalization, lower performance efficacy, that type of stuff. So we can use as a starting framework, but I want to sort of break a little bit of that framework because I see it a little differently supporting those who actually go through it. I'm not saying that those institutions don't, but it's, again, very high level, very institutional, right? And so the first piece that is clear for them is they declared that definition under the International Classifications of Diseases. So we know it's like a disease, right? It's something that's off for us, right? It's not literally something that is a good thing for our well-being anyways. But what they're also very clear about in the ICD is it's not a medical condition, right? So that's really important as well because, speaking, from this lens for this podcast is, I'm not an MD. I can go into a little bit of my creds later. I'm not an MD. So the good news is, for those who have the medical challenges, conditions, this is for informational, educational purposes. And if you need medical support, feel free to consult a medical practitioner. But from the lens of burnout, it's not a medical condition. And so we can explore this as what they call a workplace phenomena, right? And so how I want to sort of like shift their definitions is the first thing they say is it's a management or mismanagement, so it presupposes you can manage it, of chronic stress, right? And so when it comes to stress, like going to the gym, right, we can manage stress. Totally manageable. I think that helps us to grow. That's why we call it eustress, right? But the idea of managing chronic stress, the keyword being chronic, I personally believe that's a little bit of a mislabel because in my books, that is the definition for suffering. Like you can minimize or eliminate chronic stress. You can manage stress, but you do not want to manage chronic stress. The day we manage chronic stress is the day we have a recipe for not just for suffering, but what I call coping. Right, so we want to move away from coping cycles because that will, especially with the world of internet and the looming AI that's coming in hot and fast, our mental and emotional well-being will go to zero pretty quickly, right? And so that's the first piece of the definition that I want to lay out there for those to sort of feel out how we want to navigate this piece. And so how I like to use it, especially those coming in for my intakes, is I like to lean on the personal development world, just because they've done a good job of framing how we can look at our well-being from the lens of habits, right? Since we're using the word chronic stress, keyword being chronic, let's change that word to patterns. And those patterns in the personal development world is what we call habits, right? And so to make the definition really simple so we can actually begin interventions in a very easy way is when you spend more energy than you can recover as a habit, that's burnout territory. Right. And so what I akin it to is sort of financial health as well. If you're spending more than you make habitually, I'm not talking about your random Disney vacation for your family, right? It's just one of those things where if you're habitually spending more than you can make financially and the interest is compounding on you, well, guess what? You're going to move into bankruptcy. Same thing on the mental emotional side. And so when we begin to audit your life and to look at professionally and family and all these different areas, and you begin to realize, well, habitually I'm actually spending more energy, emotional energy, mental energy, physical energy, sometimes even spiritual energy for the folks who are inclined in that space. If you don't like the word spiritual, use the word purpose, right? A lack of purpose and meaning in life, right? You can very quickly get into a lot of the symptoms that we can exhibit when we go through chronic stress and burnout. So general definitions, I guess, that's how I'll lead with.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got
Well,
it.
that was pretty.
We'll just end the show now.
Yeah, that was like, wow. That was pretty awesome. I mean, the way I view that or listen to that and try and correlate it to what you were saying, kind of like even in finances, is like, you're spending more than what you're taking in, right? So, I think of that like you're talking about stress. There's the positive stress, right? That
Yeah.
we deal with going to the gym. You're going to grow muscles. I mean, for therapists, that's kind of what we do, right? That's in our wheelhouse. And then there's this negative stress. Well, I know you said it's not stress, but
Yeah.
if you're looking at like bank accounts and balances and stuff like that, I could see maybe that's where the work aspect of it comes in. And maybe that's a very generalized way of looking at it. But yeah, it's profound. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, and just to go with what Jay was saying, I mean, stress for me, stress is fuel. It helps me get things done. And I guess my question for you would be, what are the signs of somebody that
Yeah.
is using stress as fuel? How do you know it's going too far into a burnout territory?
Actually, things like what I call it some days in our world is anxiety-based performance. I say this because like back to habits, right? Is most of us, at least in the I'll call it the modern world or modern cities, urban cities, if you've ever gone to any form of like institutional schooling, like public school or private school,
Mhm.
back in like what the 40s, 50s, 60s, that type of time, like very into schools were designed for labor, call it that way, right? Like you want to move into the labor market and everything about labor and GDP and capitalism for the win, all those different things. Now, the challenge with that is early on, habitually, anyways, I'm talking about like post AI and stuff like this, but early on, it sort of conditioned us that, life was all about competition, survival of the fittest, which some of that is true. But it was during a time when world was slow. We didn't have the internet, we didn't have technology, things that were going at, that can amplify things, right? Very quickly, including the bad things for stress or amplify stress, right? And so, the challenge with that and sort of that competitive mindset is when you're moving into, oh my gosh, if I don't do this right, I'm going to fail. You have all these different poor mindsets that move us into things like anxiety, right? That then becomes our operating model. And so I'll go through sort of what I generally call the five paths, and then I'll give a little bit of a framework. We'll start with a framework, and then we'll move into sort of the nuances of what that means for in the physiotherapy world. So broadly speaking, I call this the five paths. And when I say the five paths, I don't mean this in a way as one or the other. It can be many or all of the above. And so for the first area around burnout is sort of the no-brainer one. It's exhaustion, right? Is when you hear the word burnout, unlike like things that you get in the DSM, is it's a metaphor. You don't get metaphor. Like brain fog's probably a metaphor, right? But burnout's a
Yeah.
metaphor. Like unconsciously we understand what that means. And so when we hear the word burnout, it's almost like the flame inside us have been extinguished, right? It's very soul sucking. People use words, body words like, oh man, I'm going through a grind, right? This is such a soul sucking job, right? And so, our unconscious mind, the parts that operate all the things that we're not have to be aware of, just like our heartbeat and stuff, speaks in metaphors. And so the first piece is we know there is a fatigue exhaustion component to it. But what's really weird in burnout when it comes to symptomology is the other side is true as well. So you go from exhaustion, not just I'm tired and I can't sleep it off, emotional exhaustion. We move into anxiety, right? So the second bucket or second path, I'll call it, is like at the extremes, everything from panic attacks to insomnia and sleep issues to just high anxiety. Not even talking about disorders, right? I'm talking just like you're just always anxious or always on or vigilant all the time. And so it's kind of counterintuitive, right? It's like, oh, I'm feeling burnout, but really your body's always on go, 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 go on overdrive. Our nervous system is on overdrive. And so the second bucket we look at, or the second path, is anxiety. The third path is what we might call depersonalization, checking out, or even the words rampant cynicism. And I like to use this one because this is probably the hardest one, other than some temperaments, for us to be self-aware of. The first two, we can be self-aware because in body, we can feel those sensations. And so how I like to describe this one usually is, we kind of all know somebody, could be a boss, could be an in-law, it could be a sibling or a parent or somebody that's always very cynical or hypercritical. And so you're walking in, you're a little bit optimistic, you have that positive growth in your life, you have goals you want to set. And they're the first ones that rain on your parade. They're the first one that has almost like no energy, it's like a very stop break. And so the challenge with that, and you can feel that as a second person, is, oh my gosh, that's just so draining to be around that person. Right. Sometimes we go to the holidays and there's that one relative that's just like that. It's like, oh, it's incredibly draining, especially if we're in corporate workspaces, like managers who are like that, derail cultures, right? Like, I get it. There's times to be risk adverse, but there's times where, as a temperament, but there's times where there is this layer of what I call baggage or unresolved pain or hurt that you've had in your life. So you build this belief system or this shield that the world is out there to hurt me. And so I'm going to literally move away from that pain by creating this whole thinking process to really prevent further hurt. Right now, the challenge with that from an emotional perspective, even from a mental perspective, is you can imagine how tiring it is for people around you, right, to do that. Now, for those people who are like, oh my gosh, it's so exhausting to be around you, you can now imagine from the first person, what the heck is going through their head, self-talk, every moment of their life that's helping them move away from that pain. It is extremely emotionally exhausting, right? But we just cope with it all day, that we just numb ourselves out, and therefore we move into depersonalization, where we just check out, right? We just check out and we move into what we might call disengagement, right? So you don't want to disengage, especially if you're working with people. You're on the front lines to look out for people's health and best interests, and you're checked out. Mistakes can happen, those type of things, right? That's sort of the third path. The fourth path is the common one that, especially when it comes to careers, workplace, professionalism, is probably where we're the most like keep our eyes on, right? And that's what we call like low performance efficacy. Right. So I can say this from a practitioner's lens, I can say this from a workplace lens, right? So the workplace lens is you come in, you're a professional, and of course, you're passionate, you're creative, you're really good with your art, you have all the nuances, you're in the flow state, so you do all those amazing things. One day, and then suddenly it starts to deteriorate. And not just are you checking out, for example, you're starting to hit performance challenges, right? Like, oh my gosh, I'm not getting the right things anymore, I'm making more mistakes, right? If on the administrative side, like, yes, you do that physical work. If you need to do reports and all those different things that, like one, especially from a practitioner sense, we don't like to do those things, right? Where we like to serve with our own, the skills that we've learned. But we know, especially doctors and frontline workers, half our time is with admin work, right? Mm-hmm. And so what used to take us like 30, 50, 40 seconds, even with AI or recording that type of stuff. And now we're staring at the screen for, 5-10 minutes, and you compound that for all of your clients for the day, especially in high transactional loads with back to back to back to back. Well, guess what? Your clinic closes at 5 or 8, depends on your hours, and then you're spending another 2 hours, grinding through that, and it's getting longer. That's so exhausting. And so when our performance begins to deteriorate in the corporate spaces, that's when we intervene with performance improvement plans. But if you're like a practitioner, or solopreneur, or business owner, you may not have that self-reflection, and then you get into sort of, I feel bad because, man, my performance is getting degraded. And I know it's me, but I feel so helpless. I don't know what to do about it. And your hands up in the air, and maybe it's burnout. I don't know. It's something that's happening. I don't know. I don't have a label for it. But something is happening. What do I do? So that's probably what a lot of physiotherapists listening to this would be like, oh my gosh, I think like what I've been trying to call out inside is coming out. And the last one, number 5 on this path, sort of what we call like loss of identity or some existential type mode, right? And so worst case scenario is midlife crisis, right? But it's not about some sort of life crisis. It's usually, we hear the words like, it's such a grind, it's so soul sucking, that sort of values misalignments that we move into, who am I? What is this whole purpose for this anymore? And we'll exhibit things like depression and sort of loss, just sort of really moving in and sort of unhinging and collapsing from the inside. And then we all know, like, this is very well studied, is for those who hit these identity crises, especially with looming AI, good news, PTs out there, AI can't take your role, so you're good. But for the knowledge workers out there, you fall into identity challenges, right? Now, from a PT's perspective, your identity is a caregiver, right? Because we're caregivers, right? We care for the folks, especially in health. Right. And so we can fall into, in that space, moral injury. It is no longer can I caregive in that way that I can to my best, and it's eroding on my identity. And even worse, is sometimes is when you move into like the insurance world and that type of stuff, and you just literally it's like double booking, you're doing all those things just to make it work, and you're like, oh man, I'm burned out, and I'm no longer being able to serve the way that I was meant to serve, and you have this sort of self like dark night of the soul depression moments, and it soul crushes you. Yep, that's sort of that category as well. And all of these get intermingled and intertwined.
Yeah, I
But
was going to ask you.
I have all five of those.
Yeah. Randall, we won't make this personal. Yeah. I wanted to ask you. So that, there's a few things which popcorn in my head as I'm listening to this. So, um, you, all these are paths, and you said they can all intermingle. It's not a progression. In other words, you're not going through like stages of this, like stages of grief or stages of. Do you understand what?
Mhm.
Yeah.
You're not going like, hey, today I feel cynical, so next I can expect to go to the next
Yeah. Yeah.
level
The
of
five
this.
stages of grief.
Yeah. I
Right,
love that.
Yeah.
right,
I love this. So there is literature out there that calls it the 12 stages of burnout, those different things. If you study it,
right.
I don't want to get us stuck in our heads just because, one, for PTs especially, we're in our bodies. But two,
Right.
what's really great about chronic stress and burnout is we feel it in the nervous system. We feel it. There's pain. Even if it's emotional, we feel it. So let's go into the nervous system approach to doing things. And so how I like to frame this and make it easy for everyone to digest is just think burnout is, and the whole mental, emotional well-being, health component to it is not on or off. It's like I'm burnt out or I'm not, right? And so what we use in the sort of the mental health world, we call it the mental health spectrum. And the keyword isn't mental health, the keyword is spectrum, meaning is it happens on a spectrum, and it differs every day, depends on what you eat, depends on the environment, depends on all these different things. We can fall into some days it happens more than often, right? And so what we do want to pay attention to is the chronic nature of it. Is it like increasing from a chronic perspective versus like, one-time type things? And so how I like to address those is if you take those 5 paths, those 5 elements, and you were just to put yourself on a very simple, I call it a number system, right? 0 being it rarely, often, or it doesn't even happen often, like it's rare, right? To 5 or 10 being like it happens all the time. What you're going to do is just rate yourself, right? Like any given moment and look at the trends of it, right? Like exhaustion 0 to 10, like where are you? And you're like, oh my gosh, I think I'm hovering over time, like an 8 there. Or if it's on the anxiety piece, like I'm not an anxious person, maybe like a 2 or 3. I got a good self-care practice. If it's depersonalization or the cynicism, it's like, oh my gosh, everyone doesn't like hang around me. I'm lonely all the time and just like, whatever. Maybe that's a 5 or a 6, right? If it's in the performance side, like the efficacy side, it's like, oh, because I'm my own boss, right? I'm my own practitioner. I look at that. I got to keep myself high performance all the time. So maybe like a 3 on that scale. And oh my gosh, I'm having those moments of like, should I just completely, I'm not fit to be a PT anymore, and I just like, just completely just take a vacation and relocate to Bali or something, some random thing like that, right? Then okay, that's like going to be on an 8 or a 9, right?
Mhm.
And so those things kind of differ, but a snapshot is really good because it sort of looks at sort of across that curve, that bell curve, like sort of where you are, so that we can really begin to intervene on the patterns behind that. And so you can imagine when someone comes into to my clinical practice, is I literally, when I do what I call an energy audit protocol, is because we're all creatures of habit, quote unquote, is, and you can look at your calendar for a PT, because we can run on our calendars being support our clients, is you're going to look at your calendar, like what are all the habits that happen every day, every week, every month, every year on the professional side. And then for those who like to manage your life on the calendar, then you look at everything outside of work, your relationships, your family, your health, your personal growth, spiritual growth, that type of stuff, all the categories of life, if you want to talk about work-life fulfillment or balance or those type of areas. And you'll begin to notice broad meta patterns. Like, oh my gosh, you know what? Funny thing is, my career, actually, a lot of it is energizes me. I love it, right? Especially some founders, entrepreneurs, they go to work because it energizes them.
Mhm.
But they realize, wow, their family is very deficient and their relationships is negative, right? And it's
Mm.
high intensity all the time, right? Or high intensity very rarely, but because there is a 3-hour makeup in my daily life, it happens day to day, and I'm avoiding my relationship like a plague, right? For example, right? And then the day your professional side, you go into that that existential mode, well, guess what? Your life has no other parts of your life have zero support to help you through those problems, and you move into what we call burnout, a crisis in burnout, right? And so, that's why, especially as you're moving through that spectrum and you're realizing, wow, okay, there seems to be chronic patterns that are in not just my career. So sorry, World Health Organization. Post-pandemic, very clearly, we found when everyone was stuck at home, because we had to, because of mandates, that life actually has chronic stress as well, and they blur very clearly, right? And so, or other folks who are, and I deal with this a lot in the corporate workspace, where, for example, women might say, I worked so hard in my personal career, but now I'm actually thinking of having kids. A little different because there is a biology towards that. And they're having those challenges and they're having these identity issues going through that. That's very stressful, especially if they're moving into fertility, into perimenopause. That can lead to a lot of those challenges. And so very clearly, as you do these audits, you're like, oh my gosh, these are the things that I think about every day. These are the habits that I behave every day. And these are the general trends of the emotions I feel on a day-to-day, week to week, month to month. And you begin realizing very quickly, wow, I have a poor relationship with a few people in my life that's causing a lot of pain chronically. Or I have a predominant emotion that I haven't processed. Like, wow, there's a lot of anxiety in my life, or there's a lot of anger in my life because I haven't really sat down to look at my day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month, year-to-years, right? Like, wow, there's a lot of this looming, there's a lot of guilt in my life. There's a lot of this in my life. It's not all joy and everything all the time. And almost 90% of people coming in, most of the time they just realize, wow, looking at this entire audit, there is very little positive emotions. Like you use words like joy, love, and passion, and all these things that, I want to have a thriving, flourishing life. And you just actually look at a snapshot, like your bank statements, and you're like, wow, mentally and emotionally, I'm not in a good space, right? And so instead of using labeling words like burnout, this is how we unpack those labels, because burnout can be very different for different people. It's the most hyper-personalized things, because chronic stress, those patterns, is what makes up you as the individual and how you express it in the world, right? And how you express it in your profession, in your family, in your communities, and so forth. And that has a whole snowball effect as well.
Wow.
Yeah,
That's
very cool.
That's very deep. Yeah, I mean,
All right.
I guess a follow-up to that then is as people are listening and trying to understand this, where the thing I think I heard coming through that is network and community and the balance with regards to that. How does that play a role in those in burnout? Like
So this one's a really good one, because burnout is the opposite of that. And so I'm going to myth bust something. So the
sure.
first myth bust is work-life balance no longer exists. And so in the 70s,
Oh,
80s, like my parents' generation or a slightly older generation, when you have towns and things are slow, when mail existed, today everything is like, back in the day, my dad would read a newspaper, and that newspaper would be enough for him to navigate his week. It's one of those things, you just catch up on the newspaper. Today, we get more from a doom scroll, literally more information from a doom scroll. So our nervous systems are completely hijacked, right? And
yeah.
so the idea of work-life balance is out the door, because we can't industrialize life like we thought we could. That our hypothesis was during the world of industrialization and institutions, that's gone. The internet crushed that. And so today, modern 2026, coming out of burnout, so people always go, yeah, clearing burnout is one thing, but what's on the other side of burnout, right? Like, where do we go through this? And so sort of in terms of languaging, we might call it, like, I use the word human flourishing, right? Because we design for how do humans flourish and achieve our potentials, grow, and do all those different things. But really is around the idea of fulfillment, right? Like, how do we have a sense of meaning and fulfillment? And there is an art to it, and there's a science towards it, right? So I'm moving to the science piece, because the art piece is very, very personal. But the science piece is pretty general, is we know that in all areas of our life, career, our families, our relationships, those different things, our nervous system is structured around what we might call our values, what's important to us. Now, it's not some intellectual exercise like, oh, you have this huge word search thing and you circle just fancy words. Is what I do, especially on the identity side, for the change side, when we look at habitual change and transformation, is we look at your identity we look at your value system. So this is the stuff where you're a kid and this is imprinted onto you. So you intuitively know what's already important to you in life. Now, two things from that, right? From a nervous system standpoint, if it's aligned to your values and we stack it in a hierarchy, so it's not some like, big like like a huge mission statement or something. It's literally in your career. You look at the top 5 values that drive your career, your top 5 values that drive your relationships and your health and your family and so forth. And then we look at alignment, right? So we look at that to realize, well, there's two things or a few things happening there, but two really big broad ones. The first one for someone like a PT, for example, because again tied to frontline workers, doctors, that type of stuff, is when you violate your values, right? So that's immediate pain. So it's important to you when you're doing something in complete violation of that, you move into moral injury territory, right? So I'm pretty sure PTs out there took some course along those lines for their own self-care around what moral injury stands for, right? But the other side is true is if you don't express your values in those areas, best case scenario is like, you're just disengaged, like you're just flat, right? And so sometimes in the corporate space, we use these words like, oh, diversity and inclusion and all these checkboxes that they want to, it's really great, all this inclusive stuff. And then you'll have your DEI advocates to be like, I don't get it. Why aren't people just excited about it as I am? Because from a DEI's expert's lens, it's top of their value stack. From a regular employee's lens, maybe it's joy, maybe it's collaboration, maybe it's something very different. And so what happens is when we start to project all these different values, because our entire world is more so today than ever, so politically charged across the world, everyone's just like vomiting all their beliefs and values onto people, and it becomes noise, right? And so our nervous system's like, I haven't even sat down to understand what's important to me, let alone not even understanding that what's important to me can be differentiated in different categories, right? If someone's coming in for relationships and they're like, man, I'm just not passionate in my relationships anymore. And, we both knew coming in that love is important. Of course, like universally, we know that love is really important, but love means, roses and candles for someone, and it can mean like balls and chains for another, right? So there's books written about, there's 5 love languages and all these different strategies, right? And so same as career, same as everything. And so when we're not designing our areas of life around things that arouse our nervous system in a positive way and protecting ourselves so that when we violate our values, we have boundaries and recovery strategies for it, we just go. And by the way, if you violate a value, sometimes at a worst case, you get traumatized, right? Quote unquote traumatized. If you don't process that, you're going to become that person that just defends themselves all day. Like you're hyper vigilant, protecting yourself. You don't feel safe, right? You don't feel safe. And so these are really important components when it comes to sort of looking at designing around work-life fulfillments. And then once you don't need to be super positive in one area. You just want to know that in all areas of your life, you don't want anything to be zero. So just at least like negative, sorry, just want to be net zero. Don't be negative, right? So you can lean on other areas of your life and then slowly grow different areas. And I promise you that for everybody, there's always going to be one area that naturally with temperaments and growing up and those things that you're naturally strong in, right? So if you're wondering, oh, why is it that someone's so strong in family values, but could not care at all about paycheck, right? They just don't care, right? And then you just realize, okay, cool. How do we find those balances? And how do we make sure you're not negative? So when we think paycheck, you're not like vomiting in your mouth. You're actually like, okay, well, at least make it like a positive, like a right. 1. It doesn't be a 10, a 1 or a 2, so that, when you do not spend time with your family, you have something that you want to contribute to the world. And for those who are going through empty nest syndrome or empty nest problems, they go through that identity crisis as well, and they can go through all those chronic stress patterns because they've been like that protective parent for so long that once the child is out the door, well, guess what? All of your behaviors are still running on the day-to-day. If you don't change those, right, your nervous system doesn't know the difference except you're staring at an empty house, but your body is on go, 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 for example, right?
I do want to get to part of the solution for people that are suffering from it, but I was wondering if you had like a personal journey that you went through yourself that led you into this area.
So, and this is for everyone as well. So my hands up goes in the air because I experienced it in a time when burnout wasn't even like something for the corporate worker. So I started off my career as an engineer, of all things, before even going into private practice so my modality that I practice, board certified with the Association of Integrative Psychology, is what's called neuro-linguistic programming and clinical hypnosis. And so it's really just fancy for my specialty is in the mind body, like psychosomatic work, right? Connecting those dots. And that's why burnout is a beautiful space for me, because it's about connecting those dots and making sure we move back into congruence and processing things that are not. And so for me, when someone comes to me, if I was to go to, my younger self was to come to me in the modern day to be like, oh, I'm experiencing something I can't really label yet. For me, how did it look like? It looked like nervous picking my entire right eyebrow off, right? Because I was running an equivalent of an emergency room for IT as an engineer. So I worked for a telecom, like an AT&T of the world. And my job was to make sure that, uptimes are always there, right? Not just engineering and designing those systems, but when it went down, I'm ER mode. Like I'm there to make sure I'm restoring systems fast. So I was always on. But everything from big impact, like high intensity system outages, all the way to individual folks who are like, oh my gosh, I can't make a text, or this phone is off, and how do we, design our systems around that? So, design teams and everything's around that to make it work. And so, super successful in that. 10 years into that role, I nervous picked my entire right eyebrow off, because everything was always just me going, oh my gosh, like some people do this or whatever it is. I'm doing this, right?
Oh,
Yeah,
wow.
exactly. Right. So I'm doing that. So I create a nervous tick, right? So you can start seeing physical stuff coming out from that, right? It's one of those, if I at that time was going to see a massage therapist, right, would be, Doug, why are your shoulders so tight? Like literally, we just saw each other like 4 weeks ago and we loosened it up. It's tight again, right? Not a physical issue. That's a mind-body issue. Very clear, right? So PT, same thing if you're doing the recovery piece, but you get it to a level and it's just not healing for your client. No longer a physical issue, mind-body issue.
Right. Sure.
So then my pant size, when at my prime of my career, from a pant size 31 to a pant size rounding up to 34. So it wasn't even the doctor being like, ooh, Duncan, I think you're a little bit overweight. There was no like BMI and stuff like that back in the day, right? It wasn't that popular. And so it's just, and for me, like, even though I stepped on the scale, I was so like, how to boil a frog, right? I was so like normalized to it. It didn't really click until I was like, oh man, like I used to, like my pant size used to be so like 30, that was sort of like the prime of my day. And what the heck happened? Stress weight just ballooned, right? So those are issues. So it's not like, oh, Duncan, are you hitting the gym or balancing your nutrition or whatever? It wasn't just that. It was the stress, the chronic stress, and then coping mechanisms of using food and stuff in an unhealthy way created some very unsavory habits, right? Especially around food habits, right? And so very clearly from that, I was like, oh my gosh, I'm going through something, what's going on? And this is what I call the deal breaker in my life. And some people may relate to this, is I was also in like a 7-year relationship. I was in my quarter life crisis or my late 20s. So you can imagine during that time, it was a whole, Duncan, at this point, I think it's time for you to get married. I had just put a down payment on my home. It was the beginning of the Western white picket fence notion of things. And then my partner at that time, she was like, Duncan, I don't see a future with us. Back to the values work, right? Is I was so checked out in my life. I was on life support, but I was really great in my professional world. That gave me passion in life. But even too, that wasn't life support, but I had enough positive habits there to help me move up the career progression. Relationship progression was stale and going downhill. And so you can imagine I'm so checked out that even I had my phone on the table as we were having our date nights, thinking about work or thinking about not growing that relationship side of things, area of life. And she was like, I don't see a future with us and we are done. And so a big part of my identity was there. Like, oh my gosh, like I thought this was going to be marriage, the kids, everything, the pipe dream that I thought about. And that piece of it imploded my identity. And then I'm like, oh, it's not just like a breakup, like a high school breakup or a college breakup. It was like, I thought I had it all. I thought I was at the peak of of where life should be. I was checking off all the boxes, going through all the goals. And now you hit that soul moment, that spiritual moment, where it's like something deeper inside that doesn't make sense from the rational mind. That's just not about, oh, okay, it's a breakup. All breakups are hard or whatever it is. It was deeper. And that's when I went full blown, who am I? Why do I exist? What's the whole point of this? To be quote unquote successful or achieving what I'm meant to achieve, to appease the parents because of the whole Asian, be a doctor or engineer type thing,
Right.
to family and marriage and relationships and career. Like it all went to zero pretty fast, right?
Uh-huh.
Today, people can scroll on a documentary on Netflix and have an identity crisis, especially for our Gen Zer folks, right?
Yeah,
Literally, oh my
for
gosh,
sure.
so helpless, right? The world is
Yeah.
over. AI's gonna take my job, right?
I'm sure everybody's treated a BPPV patient and they've come back and they're still dizzy. But you recheck Dick's Hallpike, it's negative, and they had no symptoms in Dick's. So what's going on? Come to Hawaii and find out.
So before we're cut off, you're talking about um, just how your identity was thrown for a loop when you had a breakup,
Yeah,
a
so I mean,
personal
for
breakup.
many people who, so it comes back to the saying how burnout's on a spectrum. We kind of don't know. I mean, I don't know if people might get a chuckle from this, but if you watch like shows like White Lotus on HBO, or if you watch
I
shows
do.
or another show like Beef that was on Netflix,
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
you know how we hear the words like people are going unhinged or they're unraveling? Yeah, that's usually a sign of, when that chronic stress, if there's an undercurrent to life that's making it worse and worse and worse. And obviously TV dramatizes it, but it helps us to get aware that, you know, it's actually the most challenging for change work if you're sort of just numb. Like it's like you're fed just enough to go through the motions of life, but not bad enough that things need to change. And so that's sort of what we call like the gray zone, right? That gray zone where you can literally go through 5, 7, 10 years of your life, look back and go, what the heck just happened, right? And so a lot of folks that do come and who are listening, so I do want to say this with compassion, is when, from an awareness perspective, if you're starting to realize like, am I like beyond or have I crossed a few points, the point of no return, or it feels like there is an increasing undercurrent of stress in my life that just, it's almost as if you're paddling, you're doing all of your self-care stuff, you're doing the things that, just get you coping, the keyword being coping. But it seems that either you're missing now because you don't have the time and energy to cope better, and or you've hit a few things where now you're just guilty. Oh my gosh, it's because of life or this or that that I didn't do that. And that's where it led to this problem, this specific. And from the outside, it's like, wow, this person's getting a little unhinged, right? Maybe you snapped at someone, you flipped the table, maybe you had a moment, or, when I work with a lot of female clients, like, oh, why are people telling me, like, I hate it when people are telling me to stop being so emotional, right? So it's not just
Mhm.
like a hormone. It's hormones or just perimenopause or something, which some of that's true. And there's also a lifestyle chronic stress component to it. And so from a work-life perspective or from all areas of life perspective, just begin noticing if there is that sort of point of no return. That's a moment where you seek help. I'm not saying that it's sort of the same thing as a lot. I can DIY my physio, but there's just a point where it makes a lot more sense
Right.
to seek a
Yep.
professional. And so in this case, because we're so good at coping naturally, that's why we're so quote unquote resilient or tolerant as human beings. We're doing our job. We're doing our job really well, by the way, until it can't, and that's when it's good to seek professional support, not just from the lens of knowledge and much like in our practice, like in PT practice, why you'll seek a professional, but just holding that space to make sure you can, even if you want to DIY yourself, hold the space so you can DIY. I went to a PT before where they're like, Duncan, you don't have to come here every week. I'm here to hold the space. Why don't I just write you sort of what you can do at home and then come back every 2 weeks or 3 weeks instead. And we'll make
Mhm.
sure that you're doing your homework and you're seeing improvement and they can do the measurements. Same thing, right? So
Okay.
if you're a PT going through that, just the minimum of someone to write you sort of what that protocol is so you can DIY at home. That's better than trying to figure out yourself when you have no willpower left in your life. So really important there.
So if I could ask, depending on like where they see themselves on the scale, clearly if they're at the really further end of the spectrum where there's that negative balance, and they're numb, probably there's some level of depression involved in, seeking out guidance. I get that, but what about the candidates who are kind of like early on and they're like, oh, I'm listening to this podcast and I see a couple of things that, you know, I see a couple of characteristics there which are maybe, bubbling up. What are some ideas that you might have for those individuals?
Yeah, so just to give a little bit of a framework for everybody, I'll give four levers to play with.
Please.
So just like we did before, the energy audit, you're just sort of looking, you don't need to audit your life. Just know what's something that really stresses you out and it's happening a lot of the time, right? For example, going to work, right? Like the commute is brutal, right? If you're especially in LA or something like that, or Toronto or something like it's just every day that happens. Then you start to audit, like, what's that one thing, peeling the onion that I can change in my life that can make the biggest difference, right? It's almost like the 80-20 rule, right? 20% of this of things happening in my life cause 80% of the stress, right? So just pick one and peel the onion. These are four levers or a lens to look at. The first one is nervous system, right? So it comes back to safety, right? So you want to create or build more safety in your life. And so, generally speaking, if you're going into your clinic or your office or whatever it is, it's generally safe. Obviously, if it's not safe, your clients won't feel safe and that won't work as well. And so you want to look at, home life, environment, like things like, do I feel safe going into what I do? And sometimes from a nervous system standpoint, no matter how much we reframe ourselves or how much therapy we get or whatever it is, and it's stuck in our head and our nervous system are like a little bit different, right? That's why there's a disconnect between the mind and body. Burnout, chronic stress, your body feels it. You feel the stress. And so like, I'm seeing this. Is there something I can regulate my nervous system better, right? And so what I like to do, like sort of tactic for everybody, is I love using things like breath work or just breathing, right? And so it's one of those, like just basically your exhales are longer than your inhales. So be just super without even needing to be a practitioner in the space. And just take these moments of, I use a 4-8 count, like breathe in for 4, exhale for an 8 type thing, and do that in between clients, right? Because you want to reset your nervous system because sometimes you're rushed. You're like, oh my gosh, there's something I want to do, or I missed something, and then you're just, before going to the next one or the end of the day or between things or coming into the office from traffic or whatever it is, make sure that you do like a very clear micro resets, right? So you want to get your nervous system in a state of flow, right? You can move into your creative side where unconsciously all of your different exercises comes out really well, right? And the way you speak to people, the way you build rapport and connection, easy peasy, right? But once you're starting to have, I'm rushed from another meeting, sorry, I just came up from another thing, and you didn't even get a moment to wash, or you just wash your hands, you just do like minimally what you need to do for the next person, and you care for them, you wish you weren't late or whatever, do make sure that you take that few seconds for that breath to regulate yourself. I'd rather the client wait a bit because you're coming in 100% versus you're coming in like 50, right? So really, really important.
Yeah.
So first lever, nervous system. Second lever to look at is what we call energy management, right? So very similar to the audit is spiritual purpose. Do you feel meaning doing this? Mental, is literally a cognitive overload or cognitive load is too much. You're thinking about too many things. A lot of it's admin for therapists. Like a lot of those things have nothing to do with the practice, but it's about your business, right? And so are you getting a little bit of mental overload, emotional overload, right? Like, are you actually dealing with anxiety? Are you dealing with nervousness? Or are you dealing with a little bit of anger that's unprocessed, or guilt is a big one as well? Violating your values, you feel pain from that, right? Feeling a little bit of hurt. Somebody said something, right? You haven't processed that. You better process that because you're still not going to care the next day or a week or a month, and it's going to bite you a year later, right? Or have that snowball. It's not good. So you want to make sure that your energy is managed, and that's why, just like you said, like maybe for those who are more prevention right now, they're more positive than negative. Very good, more prevention. But we're starting to realize, oh my gosh, those emotional debt payments are getting higher. The interest rates are compounding. Let's interrupt myself and maybe even go to a Jet Rehab experience for burnout recovery, right? To clear out some of that. That's maybe 60% recovery, 40% preventative, right? You can play with levers in that different way, right? The third one is what we call identity, right? Is what I call permission. How do I build or create more permission in my life? And in this specific world, it's going to be, you want to get clear on your values. You want to understand of your values, which beliefs are move away, that come from some sort of baggage or comes from some sort of thing that you haven't resolved yet. So you see the world in a half empty way. And so, as that stacks up, you want to make sure that on the identity side, on the building capacity around giving yourself permission to feel authentic in you and all those different things, that you do a little bit of alignment there, right? And so there are levers or processes there to make that work. I like to use a process called mental emotion release, is what I use when I design my retreats. A really big one for deep level, process trauma, process those things in a very quick way. And the last piece is environment. Now, this one probably won't be as big in the PT space and say a corporate environment, which you actually deal with toxic managers and cultures and managers and those different things. But just from the simplicity of from a Jet Hab culture perspective, is that's why we go on these retreats, right? Because when you're in the city doing this, like no joke, I could have had my clinic beside the Canadian Addictions Mental Health Institute. I don't do that. I do that on resorts, and I do that with hospitality crews because I know immediately when you leave your space, pattern interrupt, the environment changes you. Like clearly, your patterns don't align with a different space, and then we can regulate you very quickly and move into transformation and change work with a lot least resistance, and you would in something that you're comfortable with. That, oh my gosh, when is this over? Because I need to, take care of my kids or walk my dog or go grocery shopping or whatever.
Right.
Or my clients are waiting, or I got to go back and finish off a few like of those referrals or whatever, right? Or finish. So it's all those things that when you're outside in a contained and in clear environment, you can really do some deep and rapid change when it's well designed.
Awesome.
Yeah. I mean, you just articulated, because I was always confused. I was like, when we do our courses, let's say in Bali, Thailand, somewhere where you're away from your everyday life, I was always confused. Like, why are people soaking in this education so much better? And after hearing what you just said, it all makes sense.
Yeah, because
Right,
if you're especially around nervous system and safety, like you walk in regular, like just looking at the horizon, like your eyes are in lateral vision, so you're moving into the parasympathetic states, right? And that's where learning happens. They're not going to learn in stress state. If they're taking notes and stuff and doing like full classwork, there's a moment for that. Then there's a moment of like, how do we very quickly put this into action? If I was to do this in a school, like a sort of a workshop in a city or something, it feels like school again. Some people get triggered by that too, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you're a high performer, that's great in your academics, but for some, how do we design learning in a different way? And that's why retreats has a very different learning integration components, and it's, in my opinion, a lot more real. It can get very real very quick, just because you open up, you bring in a lot more context that's like personalized, and you can apply solutions versus something you might even do online or an online class or a coursework around those lines, or a webinar or something like that, right?
Right.
Great. Did you have a question, Randall? Or...
Oh, go ahead, Jay.
You can follow up on that, and then I can go ahead.
Well, I was going to move on because I wanted.
Oh, okay.
I was more curious to know, like you and your job, like what is your day to day? I always tell, when I have residents, I always tell them, to try not to get burned out. It's hard to unburn yourself, and it's like cooking, right? You can't unburn that dish you cooked. But you're the first person that I've seen where you're going through the process of unburning. And is that like what your day to day is? You're dealing with people like that?
I have a private practice. So again, I do private practice in burnout recovery, but 80% of my life is actually building the infrastructure around that. And so in 2018-19, when I was sort of tasked to look at a systems level, like how to do with burnout, because I remember WHO deemed it a workplace problem. Today, we know it's not just a workplace problem. In fact, of those 4 levers, environment is the last lever, is one of 4 levers. So yes, is there work on the environmental side? Absolutely, right? There's tons of work to do on the systemic change side. But really from an individual standpoint is, even if you change the environment, if the chronic patterns at the individual are still there and not changed, they will morph the environment over time. And so there's no point. Like there really is no point. And so it's not to say put the onus on the individual. And so when I got into this space, originally it was, let me just take sort of that practice and I'll just, do I open up a clinic somewhere in a mental health sort of a district in Toronto, when I'm from Toronto. And, I had spent a decade, a little bit more than a decade, moving, career transitioning out of an engineer and into the space of human flourishing, and then learning a modality specifically because I thought it was going to be useful for myself to realize at that point as an engineer, still like a systems change leader, that I had a chance to work with a group called the World Economic Forum, and less the whole industrialism stuff. But they were very really big into an idea of like we're gonna have all this like disruptive tech, AI now front row and center for us.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And my question at that point is I had just been 3 years into building a school out in Ghana, working with the UN and stuff for the future of education for rural communities. And I was like, I'm all about not just the humanitarian stuff, but how do you empower youth to be the change agents of the future? And that was sort of my thesis and passion, and that was a really big part of my thesis and my work in that time. And I asked during this whole disruptive wave, like, you're coming in with all this tech, what are we going to do with our mental emotional well-being? Because as an engineer, and I could speak in that space because that was my former role, when we introduced social networks and social media, full hijack. Like today, like we still suing Meta, right? It's just we're still figuring it out. AI is, let's not talk about it, right? Like we're going to get there one day. And I said, well, how are we going to deal with the mental emotional side? And they're like, hey, that's a consciousness leadership problem. That's not a technology problem. And so they go, Duncan, you're really passionate with the systems work. Like, why don't you start looking at sort of this side of things? And it was just during that time that coincided that burnout was coming out in terms of a label for the grand world, like, becoming more mainstream. And so from an infrastructure lens, my day-to-day when I was working this thesis was, okay, do we just open up clinics? Like, what are we going to do? Like, people don't understand how to get burnout support. Future of work, when I ask HR leaders, they're like, the lowest liability thing is, just take a vacation. That's it. Just go take a vacation.
Yeah.
Right.
I was like, oh, cool. A path of least resistance in that case. Why don't I create supercharged vacations? Right? Forget staycations, right? Because you're still looking at responsibilities at home and oh my gosh, there's like a whole bag of laundry I didn't finish, right? Or now it's time to take my spouse to a date, right? There's all those things to sort of like backpedal. But when you're on a vacation, you're on a vacation. But I didn't want to. We also knew at that time people were having the phenomena of I need a vacation from a vacation. I mean, I'm sure someone would relate, right?
Yeah.
It's just, life hasn't caught up. And so it was 2018 to literally going through the pandemic, figuring out what a framework would be like in this space, especially for burnout recovery. And that included how do we work with small and hospitality groups, right? So I was very fortunate. The Four Seasons reached out. So shout out to Michael, he's the vice president of well-being for the Four Seasons. And he was like, well, we kind of understand because a lot of hospitals, like no joke, hospitals are coming to hospitality groups to ask us how to make hospitals more like resorts. And then he was figuring out how can I make our resorts or spas more like clinics. And they realized in wellness travel, broadly speaking, is well, right now we're just doing like yoga and facials and massages.
Right.
We no longer have depth. We don't have clinical depth in these areas. Burnout being one, but you have perimenopause, you have metabolic health, you have longevity. These are the big ones, right? That are in that space. So 2022-3, that's when hospitality is stepping up as an industry and as a business to say, hey, we can actually become a good channel for folks to get support on all aspects of well-being, but we need to build an infrastructure to make sure that we bring in the right people to turn our 10,000 square feet spas that they poured in like tens of millions of dollars for to make it accessible for those coming on property to get the loosely use the word treatments or get the protocols or the what I like to call the transformation journey done. Because in my world, when I look at, yes, can we make it clinical? That's cool. That's the easy part. We have protocols for that. But if we're spending all this money for a sort of a retreat, you don't want to turn like a Four Seasons into a rehab center. And so how do we create like experiences around that and create arcs around that? And a huge shout out to Matt Durden, who's out at the University of Utah, had created this whole transformation experience framework that we use to literally what I call like have a Cirque du Soleil experience, but when you walk in for a 3 hour, like going to watch The Lion King or Wicked, you're coming out with some form of positive change in your health and well-being. In my case, it's burnout. So when they come in these like 5-day arcs, right? We don't immediately go into the high intense stuff. We literally navigate through a whole like journey across different themes because Some themes, for example, in Puerto Vallarta, which we do one, is for reinvention. The newest one we're doing with the Isla, it's a property down in St. Lucia, is around rhythm. So that is designed specifically for women, tied into fertility, right? One we're designing out in Turkey is for de-armoring. So burnout also have different themes, right? When people are coming in, it's easy to categorize like, oh, it seems like you're going through this. In Japan, we have one called for stillness, working with the sixth senses, right? And so we know that we have these arcs that are designed in a way, and then once they go through it, to realize, oh my gosh, all these things that make us human, I eventually want to go into reinvention. Eventually, these are the things that are in part of my path for change work. And so 80% of my life is to design this piece out and to make sure that, I regulate, I wake up with a practice, I follow the 2020 sort of 10-10-10 rule, or sometimes 20-20-20, where it's like 20% of wake up is going to be physical stretches, exercise. I get to walk my dog, so it's a little bit useful there. 20% is some sort of mindfulness thing, meditation. I meditate, I go through a mindfulness type thing. And the third one is learning and or goal setting and or journaling of some sort. And so today versus say 3 years ago, now I talk with my AI, right? I have an AI coach that I've programmed and knows my personality and stuff, and it knows literally all my goals and all that type of stuff and things I'm learning. And I'll feed back like, hey, AI just has amazing conversation with the Jet Rehab group and blah, blah, blah. And it learns that and it says, hey, you've learned this, how do you integrate this? And every day it'll just, that 20 minutes or 10 to 20 minutes every day, I make sure it sets me up for success, right? I integrate and I do that work. And so, that primary is what I do for the day. Use breath work, use walking, I love the water, that helps me to regulate. And 3 times a week I go to the gym. Nutrition, I make it solid. I take care of my father. He's an aging parent. So now I'm looking at diet in a very different way. And then when I go to sleep, I make sure that no devices 30, 60 minutes before I go to bed for sleep hygiene. And I do something mindful, or I do something that's like relaxing, right? If I read a book or listen to a podcast, or I stream something to my speakers, so I'm listening to a podcast or something. I love those ones where they're like an hour and a half long. That's like very like ASMR, like teaching you about space or whatever. I love those. I've been following those recently, and that helps me get into good sleep. And I train myself. I don't even wake up with an alarm clock anymore, right? So I move into So that's my day to day for performance.
Yeah, I mean, before we move on, before we forget, I mean, please, for the folks who are listening here, can you please let us know, like if they were interested in your wellness retreats, and some of the work that you do, where to find you, and then obviously your where to find your retreats and such.
Yeah, so 2 websites, they both do the same thing. So the first one is Burnout Recovery Accelerator.com, a little bit long. My original brand was actually called the Burnout Clinic, so theburnoutklinik.com. You can go there as well. They both lead to the same page. You can book a call if you need a consult from there. What I recommend for everybody is just reach out to me via LinkedIn, right? So that's sort of where I hang out, and I can, we can have a chat. We can move on to email or whatever it is if need be. But I love there, and I do a lot of posting and stuff on LinkedIn as well. So if you want to follow some of the newsletters that I post there and some of the posts that I do there, I keep it as like pulse to the ground as I can, for anybody that's interested in connecting with me. And of course, if there's anything in the future, I know Jet Rehab is a huge thing. Reverse is true. Speak out to either Jay or Randal if anyone wants a burnout retreat, like a properly done burnout retreat. It's something that it's all in all of our wheelhouses, so we can cater to your community very well as well. But we need community support for that to happen. So yeah, just I would suggest everybody shout out to either Randal or Jay or team first, and then obviously reach out to me.
Awesome, thanks. Yeah, I did just want to say one last thing. I mean, what resonated with me in just the last discussion you had. So many leaders are so focused. So I was in leadership. And I still do some stuff around there. But what I'll say is there's so many leaders who will go out and they're seeking to learn about technology and AI and all these various pieces. and you see various courses offered by, various big institutions around this. And it's literally like how to make your practice, your area, your specific workspace more efficient. What can AI do? But no one's looking at the mental piece.
Yeah.
And I love what you said there. It's like, what is, that's a question I think we need to ask. There's a lot of folks who have a lot of anxiety around this. Like, what is it going to take my job away? Is it going to change the way I do things on a day-to-day level? And you see the big tech companies right now. There's a lot of disruptors coming into the healthcare space. And how is that going to affect everything? So I love looking at the aspect of it from the other from a different lens, where you're really advocating and looking for the individual and saying, hey, mentally, where does this place me, and how am I going to feel about this, and how do I walk through this space based upon everything that's going on in the world.
Yeah, I
So
want to pay some homage to the PTs out there as well, because, well, one, on the physical side, your job is pretty safe. But the reality is your clients aren't all physical folks. They're not all labor centered. And so
right,
if your clients, especially in the modern day where you get a lot of insurance that covers it and so forth, you're going to get a lot of clients coming in because they'll eventually go through what we call AI enablement and AI adoption. And so the challenge there is the identity problem. I'm actually positive bias towards AI, just because what I suggest is for AI enablement is if you can find ways for AI to automate you as much as possible, that allows you to double down on being human, right? And it's all
yes,
those like non-AI stuff that takes our capacity away from actually, one, recovering, let's just be real. But secondly, it's like for those who don't need recovery, they're on the high performance, peak performance side of things, is that's optimized. That's when you can do optimizing, right? But if you have no time to optimize, you're going through the grind of everything. That's what AI is for, right? So all of our governments, the U.S. government especially, is spending so much money on AI. So I think it's a thing to stay for a bit, even though we may hit a few financial hurdles going through, but coming out of it for the general public. The question that I suggest, especially if you're a PT listening to this, is one, even for yourself, like what are the tasks? Obviously, you have the easy thing because a lot of your work is physical in nature, but the non-physical things in nature that is annoying, right? The marketing, the sales, the administration, the scheduling, that type of stuff, the follow-ups, all that type of stuff, is you can spend a little bit of time to look at how AI can really give you so much leverage on that, and that will clear up your plate so you can double down on what you're gifted and talented and skilled in the most. And of course, on the identity side is tighten up, optimize your values alignment to those pieces, because in the post AI world, not just for yourself, it's one of those things where you want to be congruent inside and out. As your clients are going through sort of that struggle, they want to know. They don't want to hear that, oh my gosh, you're good to go. Like you must be solid. Your job is safe or whatever it is. Be like, hey, I went through AI enablement as well. This is what's happened in my business, and I can understand where some of this friction is. So when I'm helping you to recover because you're so stressed out and then you got into a physical accident, and they're there to share some of their emotional load with you, that you can have those conversations and look at what reinvention will look like moving forward. And I think from a more of a quote unquote bedside manner or rapport perspective for PTs, this is going to be an incredible conversation, not just a starter, but continuer, as people are going through
yeah,
some of their day to day.
yeah, awesome, cool. Randall, did you have anything else?
I have thousands of questions, more, but I mean, the main thing is like I hope one day we can collaborate, in a foreign country somewhere. Uh,
Even close
yeah.
by, I do.
Mm.
Have your community or stuff went to Puerto Vallarta before?
No,
No,
we
Yeah,
haven't been there.
I know
no,
Cabo was on your list, but Puerto
Yeah.
Vallarta is
yeah,
a beautiful place. I have some villas that are incredible. It's inexpensive as well. And
Hmm.
so if communities listening to this now, they're, oh my gosh, this is something that, I'm going through this. How do I learn the skills? So a few skills I'll
Uh,
share what a retreat might look like is, of course, you're going to have your practitioners that will regulate you very quickly, like no tomorrow, and teach you the skills to bring it home. But also the skills to help you set those boundaries, manage your energy, how to align your values, how to reset your environment, how to literally AI. I'm not joking. I've been changing a lot of some modules coming in for the learning salons is we're teaching how to use AI right into the actual learning salons, because we're realizing that automation piece is such an incredible giver of energy, of capacity for either your mental load or your emotional load because of the lack of technology. And because you're in a safe space and in a group, the emotional friction of doing on your own to install AI goes to zero. And so it's one of those things that if you know, as a PT, like, oh my gosh, this is something like I'm curious, and not just for yourself, but how can I then take these skills, share it with my kids or my spouses or my family, my sisters and brothers, or whatever it is. That's what it's all about. You know, it's not just, you know, focused on that type of education, but life education as well.
Awesome.
All
Cool.
right.
Yeah, I'd love to. That sounds amazing. I think you know, we'll definitely connect with the community and check it out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Put it in the comments if you want to go to Puerto Vallarta.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
All right.
But ladies and gentlemen, this is Duncan So. He's the founder of the Burnout Recovery Accelerator. And, you know, you just heard him speak. I mean, this guy knows a lot. And this was personally educational for me. So I hope everyone else got a lot out of this. And then, man, we'd love to have you back on at a future date when I write down all the questions I have.
Yeah.
The second 1,000. Yeah.
I love this conversation. It was so good. So good. So insightful. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. All right. Bye, Duncan.
Bye. So let's do something for 2027. Let's put it out there.
Okay.
All right.
You got it.
All right.
And we'll get something together. Maybe the CPTA will approve a course on this.
Oh, no,
Because,
I totally think they would.
Yeah.
I totally think they would. Yeah. Jetset.